Welcome to episode 9 in our series on Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto's The Way of God, and we are up to the second half of chapter 3 of this section of Providence. We're dealing with individual providence, and the first half of this chapter 3, which we dealt with in the last episode, set out the manner in which God determines individuals' providence, whether they be given money, to see how they deal with it, how they distribute it, their use of wealth, or they deny a person money and make them suffer to see how thankful or not they are for various good things, or the few good things that God will do for them, to test them. We also taught that suffering is almost like a mini blessing, because it gives us a chance to prove ourselves, like they say, a tea bag only generates its tea when it's put into hot water, and diamonds are only produced by tremendous pressure. So in this respect, we must also look at the providence as a long-term plan for man. Again, the Ramchal in the first episode, the first half of this chapter, describes how the calculations involved in a person's providence come from many, many factors that cannot be ascertained by any human being. When we look at other humans suffering, we think to ourselves, how can this be fair? Why does God allow this? But it's not that He allows it. He is the manufacturer of perhaps certain amounts of suffering, a certain path in life for people, but it's not supposed to be as a punishment per se. It's perhaps a struggle is more like a test and a trial. And in this episode, we're going to deal with when we see a tzaddik of our generation, or a tzaddik, a pious person, and their suffering. You question very strongly what is the formula for God's providence. But the Ramchal will describe how there is reason for even a tzaddik, a pious person, to suffer as almost like a messianic help to our generation in cases. So we're going to continue halfway through this chapter 3, and the Ramchal continues. It is necessary to realize that the highest providence takes account of everything associated with each detail, whether it precedes it or follows it. In dealing with each element, its ultimate effect on the whole is calculated, taking into account the manner in which every element is interconnected with every other one in the structure of creation as a whole. Thus, when an individual is judged, providence takes account of his state and level with respect to what precedes him, what follows him, and what is associated with him. Each man is thus judged in relation to his forebears who preceded him, his descendants who follow him, and the people of his generation, city and community who are associated with him. After all this is taken into account, he is then given his particular service assignment and challenge, as well as a specific responsibility in serving God. It is important to realize, however, that this is only true of one's judgment in this world. It is for this reason that we specified that what is decreed is one's service assignment, that is, the state in which he will exist in this world. His responsibility will then depend on that state. In the world to come, however, the state in which a person finds himself depends completely on his own deeds. The prophet thus said, and he quotes Yecheskel 18:20, "The son shall not bear the sin of his father." Thus, for example, if it is decreed that an individual be worthy of great riches, then his children will also be born wealthy, and unless their situation is changed, they too will have wealth and status. Wealth such as this is therefore merely the result of one's parentage. The same can also be true of poverty. Our sages thus teach us that a parent can endow his children with 5 things. It is thus possible that one be born with goods as a result of his parentage, and it is likewise possible that he should later attain goods as a result of his parents' merits. It is likewise possible that one attains good because of his children. Thus, for example, success and other goods may be granted to an individual in order that his children be born with these advantages. In a similar manner, it is possible that good or evil befall a person because of the place where he lives, or because of the group which he is associated. Besides this, there is also another concept that stems from both the individual and general aspects of providence discussed earlier. When the highest wisdom considered everything needed to rectify the human race and make it into the perfected community discussed earlier, it saw that this goal would be furthered if some people could benefit others and help them attain a place in this community. The rule that the community of the future world be restricted only to those who attained perfection in their own right is therefore not absolute, for it was also decreed that an individual can reach a level where he can partake of perfection and be included in this community as a result of his association with a more worthy individual. The only difference is that he will remain on a lower level, since he is not included in this community in his own right, but only through association with another. The only ones who are cast aside completely from perfection, therefore, are those who are not worthy of it at all, neither through their own merits nor through association with another. Because of this, the number who are saved from annihilation and allowed the ultimate bliss is maximized. Those who cause others to partake in the world to come will definitely be the foremost in that community. They will be the leaders, while those who enter by virtue of their association with them will be beholden and dependent on them. In order for this to be possible, all men were originally bound to each other, as our sages teach us. All Israel are responsible for one another. As a result of this, each individual is bound to everyone else, and no man is counted separately. God's attribute of good is the stronger, however, and if the guilt for sin is shared by others, this must certainly be true of the merits associated with good deeds. As a result of this principle, suffering and pain may be imposed on a tzaddik, or righteous person, as an atonement for his entire generation. This tzaddik must then accept this suffering with love for the benefit of his generation, just as he accepts the suffering imposed upon him for his own sake. In doing so, he benefits his generation by atoning for it, and at the same time is himself elevated to a very great degree. For a tzaddik such as this is made into one of the leaders of the community of the future world, as discussed earlier. Such suffering also includes cases where a tzaddik suffers because his entire generation deserves great punishments, bordering on annihilation, but is spared via the tzaddik's suffering. In atoning for his generation through his suffering, this tzaddik saves these people in this world and also greatly benefits them in the world to come. In addition, there is a special, higher type of suffering that comes to a tzaddik who is even greater and more highly perfected than the ones discussed previously. This suffering comes to provide the help necessary to bring about the chain of events leading to the ultimate perfection of mankind as a whole. According to the original plan, the sequence of worldly events required that man undergo at least some suffering before both he and the world could attain perfection. This was required by the very fact that one of the basic concepts of man's predicament was that God should hold back his light and hide his presence, as discussed earlier. This became all the more necessary as a result of the corruption and spiritual damage caused by man's many sins, which held the good back even more and caused God's presence to become all the more hidden. The world and everything in it are therefore in a degraded evil state, and require that God's unfathomable wisdom bring about numerous chains of events to achieve their rectification. Among the most important elements of the sequence is the requirement that man be punished for his wickedness until the attribute of justice is satisfied. God arranged matters, however, so that select perfect individuals could rectify things for others, as discussed earlier. The attribute of justice therefore relates to them rather than to the rest of the world in general. Individuals such as these, however, are themselves perfect, and are therefore worthy only of good. The only reason they suffer is because of others, and the attribute of justice must therefore be as satisfied with a small amount of suffering on their part as with a large amount on the part of those who actually sinned. Beyond that, the merit and power of these tzaddikim is also increased because of such suffering, and this gives them even greater ability to rectify the damage of others. They can therefore not only rectify their own generation, but can also correct all the spiritual damage done from the beginning, from the time of the very first sinners. It is obvious that individuals such as these will ultimately be the foremost leaders of the perfected community, and the ones who are very closest to God. All this is not only the result of justice, but also follows from the actual order of things, as discussed earlier. As a result of man's sins, corruption is increased and incorporated into both man and the world. This in turn causes God's light to be increasingly retracted and hidden. The more this corruption is cleansed, on the other hand, and the more people are purified of it, the more God's light is once again revealed, step by step. Suffering is the thing that God created to cleanse this population, both in general and in particular. Thus, through the suffering of these select individuals, creation in general is cleansed, and step by step the world is brought closer to perfection. There is another important principle regarding God's providence. God arranged matters so that man's chances of achieving ultimate salvation should be maximized, as discussed earlier. A single soul can be reincarnated a number of times in different bodies, and in this manner it can rectify the damage done in previous incarnations. Similarly, it can also achieve perfection that was not attained in its previous incarnations. The soul is then ultimately judged at the end of all these incarnations. Its judgments will depend on everything that took place in all its incarnations, as well as its status as an individual in each one. When an individual has a reincarnated soul, it is possible that he will be affected in a particular manner as a result of his deeds in a previous incarnation. The situation in which he is placed may follow from this, and this situation may bring with it the special responsibility given to him, as discussed earlier. God's judgment of each individual is extremely precise, depending on every aspect of his nature and including every detail of his exact situation. But in the future world, which is the true good, no individual is required to sustain a liability which is not the result of his own doing, but a result of his mission and responsibility in this world, as parcelled out by the highest wisdom. In cases such as these, the individual is judged accordingly. There are many details in the concept of reincarnation, involving the manner in which an individual is judged according to one incarnation, and how this judgment depends on previous incarnations. The crucial point, however, is the fact that all is truly fair and just. As the Torah states in Deuteronomy 32 verse 7, the Creator's work is perfect, all his ways are justice. No created thing can encompass God's thoughts or the profound depth of his plan. We only know that, like all other such concepts, the principle of reincarnation as one of man's experiences also follows the rule of fair judgment, as decreed by God, to perfect mankind in general. From this entire discussion, we see that there are many different and varied reasons for everything that happens to an individual in this world, whether it is good or otherwise. It is important to realize, however, that this does not mean that every event is always the result of these causes. These are merely all the possible causes, but things can sometimes result from one and sometimes from another. The highest wisdom, however, perceives and knows what is best to rectify all creation. In its profound design, it weighs everything together and directs each individual element of creation accordingly. Although creation is arranged to follow a cause and effect relationship, every cause does not always necessarily have the same effect. Many causes are almost always involved, and in many cases one will contradict each other. Thus, for example, the merit of one's parents may entitle an individual to wealth and prosperity. His own deeds, on the other hand, may require that he be poor. His place in the general scheme may furthermore exert an influence in determining whether he is granted wealth or made poor. The same can also be true with respect to the individual's own action. He may have done one deed that should result in his attaining something good. At the same time, however, he may have also done something else that would require that he not receive this very same good. Because of these many conflicts, the highest wisdom must balance and decide every factor, creating situations which are products of the various combinations of these causes with respect to each individual. Occurrences may thus be the result of one or another of these causes, but ultimately, at least one of the causes that we have discussed must be involved. The details of this judgment, however, are beyond the grasp of man's understanding, but to know its general concepts and categories is to know much, as we have explained earlier. One must also realize that things can happen to an individual both as an end in themselves and as a means towards something else. Thus, when it is appropriate that something happen to an individual as a result of one of the previously mentioned causes, then it is said to be an end in itself. Other things may happen to an individual, however, which are merely means to ultimately achieve some other end completely. With regard to such means, the Prophet said, and I quote from Yeshayahu 12 verse 1, "I will thank you, God, though you showed me anger." Our sages explain that this refers to a situation where someone's cow broke its foot and fell, and as a result he found a buried treasure. They also apply it to a case where one escapes from a calamity as a result of something that he may have initially considered a grave inconvenience. The example given is that of a person who wanted to embark on an ocean voyage and was detained and missed his ship. The ship then sank, and as a result of this inconvenience, his life was spared. Means such as these can be destined to affect the individual himself or to influence others. Something can thus happen to a person in order to bring good or evil to someone else. The highest wisdom, however, determines what should befall each individual, and in the same manner determine the means through which this should come about. Everything is ultimately decreed with the utmost precision, according to what is truly best. And that concludes the third chapter of individual providence. And so what can we take from that? What we can learn is that we all have our own paths in life. We have perhaps our own destiny, which God is laying out. Although He allows us free will to maneuver ourselves, He sets out the best possible path and hopes that we take it. We learned in this chapter that these are tests and trials, and suffering is how we react to suffering is a blessing. It can be a blessing for us. It will be noted by God how we dealt with suffering in our lives, or even how we dealt with munificence. If we are given a lot of money, a great wealth, how do we use this wealth? Do we use it in ways for just being proud of one's own wealth and displaying it in a flashy, arrogant way, or do we use it to help people who are less fortunate than us? There's another test by God. It's not only suffering that is a test. Sometimes when He provides, it's a test for you, what you're going to do with it. We learnt about how a tzaddik, a pious person, it can be a kind of like a sacrifice for a generation, and will perhaps alter the events of the future through his suffering, his or her suffering. And we learnt also that the way that God decides all of these roads of providence can only be done by a being that understands exactly what is going on in each and every one of our minds. It's not just the outward actions that determine providence, it's our inner thoughts that determine, and also the associated surroundings and positions in life that we are in. God tailor-makes our paths of providence, and he's best placed to know what's best for us. So that concludes this chapter, and next chapter 4 of this section on providence, deals with Israel and the nations.